Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to come to the rise and fall of Herod as we conclude our series between the Testaments. We left off last time with the assassination of Julius Caesar at the hands of senatorial conspirators. They gathered around him with knives and assassinated him, killed him. But that's going to make Rome leadership and throw it into a quandary. What do we do now? Now, just outside the Senate building had been Caesar's chief of staff, Marcus Antonius. Marcus, and I'm going to just call him Mark Antony. I'm going to shorten it. Forgive me for that. Um, he actually he at first goes into hiding because he thinks those conspirators might be after him next. But once things die down a little bit, he comes back out, and he's going to be at least temporarily the person that a lot of people are looking to for leadership. When Caesar's will is opened, wills work, they wouldn't keep a will in a back drawer. They would actually keep it in one of the local temples, and it would be sealed and invaluable, and no one would be able to read it until the person involved had died. Now that Caesar's died, Caesar's will is open, and it is read to the public that the gardens, his private gardens, are now going to be given to the city, that money will be given to each and every Roman citizen. And last, the most significant, is that his nephew, Octavius, is legally adopted as Caesar's son and heir. Now, Octavius, meanwhile, he was still a teenager, about to turn 20, but he's still a teenager, and he's been studying on the island of Rhodes in southern Anatolia. It's a place where a lot of young men went to go study. It would be like going to Harvard or Princeton, one of the more prestigious schools. He gets a message from his mother saying, "Your uncle Caesar has died. He has made you his heir. It's very dangerous here in Rome. Don't come to Rome. Just stay there and continue your studies." And Octavius, he's there with his best friend Agrippa. We're going to talk more about Agrippa in a bit. Octavius does not listen to the advice. He jumps on the first ship to Italy and goes immediately to Italy. He gets there and he comes to Mark Antony and he says, "Greetings, Mark Antony. I am here to to receive my inheritance. I understand I've been adopted as Caesar's legal heir. I'd like to get my hands on the checkbook." And Mark Antony says, "That's nice. This is really a job for adults. Go away, and I'll send you a few dollars, but I've got things covered here." It looks like Octavius has been outmaneuvered. So next, he goes to the Senate and he says, "Oh, noble senators, you know that money's been given to every Roman, but also I want to give you gifts for your campaign contributions. And as soon as I get the checkbook, I will make good on that." And they all turn to Mark Antony and says, "Well, give him the checkbook." And Antony is the one who has been outmaneuvered. Now, it looks like these two are actually going to be enemies at first, and the Senate actually does what they can do to sort of pit them against each other. And instead, Octavius turns that around and goes to Mark Antony and says, "Look, we haven't always seen eye to eye in the past, but we can make this work." Now, one thing Octavius was good at, he was good at convincing people. He was not a warrior. He was a politician, a consummate. He's going to be a politician in getting people to do what he wants them to do, and maybe even to get them to think it's their idea. I'm not so sure about that, but he's going to be very, very successful. Now, meanwhile, the conspirators, and the two top conspirators had been Brutus and Cassius. Now, that sounds a little bit like Crassus we had been talking about in the last class, but that's someone else. That had been one of the members of the first triumvirate. And remember, he had lost to the Parthians and had gold poured down his throat. No relationship between the two. So this is Brutus and Cassius, and they fled to the east along with the other conspirators. And there were quite a few of the conspirators. Remember, a great number of the Senate had taken their knives out and had attacked Caesar in that assassination. So they all flee to the east, and in the east they've taken what money they can with them, but they're going to try to raise funds to raise an army because they know it's not going to be long before the west is going to come after them. And so, for example, Cassius demands 700 talents of silver from Judea and Galilee. That's not just taxes. He says that is punishment for having supported Julius Caesar. Well, Julius Caesar had been the representative of Rome, and Cassius says, well, he wasn't the real representative of Rome. I'm the real representative, so you need to give me a whole lot of money. And when anybody who cannot come up with the required taxes um, is going to be in for it. Now, Antipater, right around this time, dies. As far as I know, it is of natural causes. So it's just, I'm not going to say it's fortuitous, but right at this time, Antipater dies, and that leaves Faisal and Herod right now over Judea and Galilee, and they have to raise those taxes. Now, in the case of those Jews who cannot pay the required tax, they are sold into slavery, and there will be time. There's at least one instance that I know of in Galilee where an entire village was taken and sold into slavery because the village as a whole couldn't come up with the taxes that were being demanded of them. Herod uses this as an opportunity to try to ingratiate himself with his new, can I call them taskmasters, or I'm going to call them maybe tax masters, but he's given command of troops and a fleet under Cassius, and so I'm not sure that he had a lot of choice, but he's throwing in his lot with Cassius against those Romans in the west. He receives a promise that if he complies and if Cassius and Brutus come out of this, that Herod will be king of the Jews. So they're demanding money, but they're also making promises on where this is all going to go. Now, meanwhile, Octavius and Mark Antony, remember I said they patched up their differences, and they bring in Lepidus, a Roman general. Mark Antony by this time is a general as well. Octavius isn't a general, but he's got generals on his side, including his good friend Agrippa, who's going to turn out to be a brilliant general. Um, but the three of them, Octavius, Lepidus, and Mark Antony, will form a second triumvirate, a second partnership. Now, the first triumvirate involving Julius Caesar and Crassus and Pompey, that had been initially a secret alliance. Eventually, the secret was out. There was no secret about this. This is done out in the open. And so Octavius and Antony in particular, Lepidus is guarding things back home, they're going to come into Greece, and there Cassius and Brutus will be waiting for them with an army at a place called Philippi. This is the same Philippi where Paul will much later write an epistle to the Philippians. The way the Philippians get there, the Philippians were the veterans of this conflict, of this particular battle, and those that wanted to were allowed to settle here on the site of that battle, and they would form a town. It was probably a village there already, but they would form a Roman colony here on that site, and that would give them a certain measure of independence. It's interesting to see the politics of Philippi when you read about Paul coming to the city. Well, Paul wasn't even born yet, so that's going to be quite a bit later. At this battle, remember Octavius, he's not the general, so Mark Antony is doing the heavy lifting here. But Octavian is along for the ride, Octavius. And Cassius and Brutus are defeated. They're out of the picture, and that leaves our triumvirate in charge. So the second triumvirate, now we have Octavius, he comes back to Rome. He's going to be settling here in Rome and pulling the strings here. Lepidus is given command of North Africa, so he goes to North Africa, and Antony will be in charge of the East. The East is where the action is. Julius Caesar had settled everything in the West, up in Gaul, but the Parthians are in the East too, and also the breadbasket of Rome, Egypt, is in the east, and of course we know that Judea is in the east as well. Now Herod will work now he finds himself working for Mark Antony, and both Herod and Faisal are made tetrarchs of Galilee and Judea. It is understood that yes, they had to work for Crassus, for Cassius. I'm sorry, but that was only because they had been forced to do so. And Mark Antony he was already known to them. Remember the time that Mark Antony had come down to Jerusalem when he was working for one of the governors of Syria. So he already knows them. They're on the same page. And Herod now betroths himself to Mariamne, the last surviving daughter of the last surviving Hasmonean. She has a brother that's still alive at this point, but he betroths himself to Mariamne. I think what's going on here. Remember that he's not. Um, his claim to rulership, his claim to leadership, is a little tenuous. It's connected to the Romans, and so he's going to seek out this last alliance, and to marry her, he actually has to divorce his current wife, and he does. So he gets engaged to Mariamne. They don't get married quite yet, and he obtains the freedom of those Jews that Cassius had sold into slavery. So he's ingratiating himself to the Jewish people by doing things like that. Of course, free people are taxpayers, so he might have his own interests in this as well. But also, he's trying to set himself up for the future. He's thinking ahead. Now, remember our family tree. We'd already seen Alexander Jannaeus and Alexandra. Of course, they had died much earlier. Aristobulus and his son Alexander II had both died in trying to ferment that revolt. We saw that in the last class. But now we see Antigonus II. He is the surviving son of Aristobulus II. He's the surviving son, and now he is going to conspire with the Pharisees, but also with the Parthians. The Parthians are the ruling class over the Persians in the east, and he's going to form an alliance with them, a non-Roman alliance, because the Parthians are arch enemies of Rome, and they are going to come in and oust both Herod from Galilee and Faisal from Jerusalem, from Judea. Now, Faisal is captured and he is killed. Actually, Josephus says that once he was captured, he committed suicide. He took his head and just smashed it on a rock and killed himself so that they would not be able to use him for leverage. Herod, meanwhile, escapes from Jerusalem. The attack had come in Jerusalem. He makes it 4 miles south to Bethlehem with the Parthians and the Pharisees hot on his heels. And just south of Bethlehem, he has to fight a battle because they're actually catching up with him. He succeeds. Doesn't really defeat his enemies, but it's a standoff so that he's able to escape and continue with his entourage, with his betrothed Mariamne and with others from his followers down to Masada. Masada is this big giant, looks like a big giant rock that's just stepped down, fallen down from the sky. The word Masada means fortress, and it's a natural fortress. It rises straight up from the area right around the Dead Sea. And it's almost invulnerable. You have to go straight up there. There is a little, what they call the snake path, but you can only go single file up that thing. So anybody trying to come up there could be shot at, and they could drop rocks on them. And anybody in Masada is going to be safe as long as the food holds out and as long as the water holds out. Remember, you're by the shores of the Dead Sea. Not a lot of water there. It doesn't get a lot of rain, but it does get it occasionally. And so Herod leaves them in Masada, but he's not going to stay there. He leaves, he continues south down to Petra, and from there to Egypt, where he catches a ship heading to Rome. Because his authority comes from Rome, he needs to reconnect with Rome. So Hyrcanus, meanwhile, Hyrcanus II, the high priest, Antigonus has his uncle's ears cut off. This will disqualify him from ever serving as a high priest again, because a high priest has to be physically perfect, cannot have any blemishes. Minus your ears, that's a major blemish. And Antigonus II now makes himself both high priest and king. So there's a new king of the Jews, a new high priest. The Jews have declared their independence from Rome, and the Parthians say, we're glad to help, have a nice day. And the Parthians are going to head, actually not straight back home, they're going to head up north. Now, Herod makes his way all the way to Rome, and he gets there and he meets the two movers and shakers that are there. Octavius, Antony's getting ready to go to the east, but right now Antony is in Rome. and they both take him under their wing, and Antony especially, but they both take him before the Roman Senate. And the Roman Senate, here's what's been going on in Jerusalem with the Parthians, and the Roman Senate declares Herod to be king of the Jews. The year is 40 BC. Herod is a king, but he's a king without a kingdom because there's other people holding on to his kingdom, and they are declaring themselves independent of Rome. Next, we're going to have Herod go back along with Roman legions, and Antony's going to be involved in this. And the Parthians are going to be pushed, they're already out of Jerusalem. They're going to be pushed out of the entire Levant, Syria and Damascus and Antioch will be Parthian free now. And Jerusalem, it's going to take about 3 years before the dust settles. Not till 37 BC uh, will Herod be back in town in Jerusalem, having captured it, um, and now he's going to rule from now on. When Josephus describes the length of the rule of Herod, he will make a note that you can count it from 40 BC, but then you can also count it from 37 BC all the way to Herod's death, which is going to be 4 BC. And Josephus gives us both. So there's no math mistakes that are made there. He keeps a very careful accounting. So now we have Herod back in charge of Judea. Antigonus, who had taken over, he's taken to Damascus and executed. So he's out of the picture. And now Herod marries his betrothed. He marries Mariamne. She had actually been holed up in Masada for a couple of years, waiting for Herod to come back and take charge. She hadn't gone over to the other side. She remains faithful, at least to that degree. And now he marries her. But she pressures Herod now to make her brother the high priest. Herod can't be high priest. And so now it will be Aristobulus III. He's going to be the last Hasmonean high priest. And Herod is just married now, the last Hasmonean. And in doing so, it's been suggested that perhaps he's setting himself up. Think about somebody in the past who had replaced a previous dynasty, and to do so had married the daughter of the king that he replaced. And I'm speaking of King David. Now think about the parallels. Herod's not King David, but just like David had been given the daughter of Saul, Michal, and had married her, and then, of course, he didn't replace Saul in the sense that he killed Saul or anything like that, but Saul had been killed by the Philistines, and David comes on the scene and is now eventually considered the legitimate replacement. David, whose mother had been a Moabite. Remember the story of or a grandmother, I should say. Remember the story of Ruth, not even Jewish. Well, here's Herod, similar sort of story, enough to maybe make some connections, and he's gearing up to try to be accepted by the Jewish people. I'm not sure if it's really going to work. Herod agrees to make Aristobulus III the high priest, but it's not long before he's unhappy with that result. And Aristobulus III has an accident in a swimming pool in Jericho. They're sort of clowning around all in the swimming pool. Let's dunk somebody underwater. Herod doesn't, he has his hands clean. He's not actually doing it. But everybody suspects he had everything to gain. So it is just assumed that he was the one who had given the order. And Mariamne is very, very upset at the death of her brother, very upset at Herod, and of course he's pleading innocent. Um, so Aristobulus III has died, and the high priesthood now goes to a non-Hasmonean. So it will now go to somebody else, still a descendant of Aaron, but no one from the Hasmonean line. Now Cleopatra enters the picture. You remember that Julius Caesar had left her as the sole queen of Egypt, still sort of nominally under Roman oversight. And she had borne a son with Julius Caesar named Caesarion. So, uh, yet Julius Caesar had not recognized him as his legal heir. Instead, his will had placed Octavius instead to be the legal heir, and he had adopted him sort of after the fact. So Cleopatra now comes to meet Antony at Tarsus, and when she comes, she has her ship sort of laid out like a barge with trees on it and a river flowing. It's like a miniature Nile River. And she is dressed to the nines. She is dressed so gorgeously and done up. She sweeps him off his feet intentionally, and she takes him back to Egypt, and he marries her. Now, he's already got a wife. In fact, he had been married to the sister of Octavius. And Romans didn't normally have more than one wife at a time. They didn't do that polygamy thing that sometimes you find in places in the East. But he's going to take her as his wife, still while married to Antony or to Octavius's sister. And he moves to Egypt, and after a while, they're going to start having children. And what's more is Antony begins to award her and her children, his children by her, with various possessions. He's actually giving away Roman areas that belong to Rome. He's giving them to Cleopatra and to her children. Now, some of these are taken away from Herod, who is back to ruling now in what we think of as Judea, Galilee. I'm just going to call it Israel. But some of these are taken away from Herod. And as this goes on, Octavius, he's fit to be tied, and he goes to the Senate and says, "Do you see what is happening here?" And this is going to lead to war with Rome, where the Senate will declare war not on Antony. Antony's supposed to be one of theirs. He's supposed to be their representative. They declare war on Cleopatra. Now, they might as well have declared war on Antony. It's a legal nicety, but they declare war on Cleopatra and upon Egypt. That conflict between Octavius and Mark Antony, and of course Cleopatra, that's the one they've declared war against, that will be settled at a place called Actium on the west coast of Greece, where there will be a naval battle that will be fought over who runs the Roman Empire. The year is 31 BC. At this battle, uh, you have Octavius, and remember how I mentioned he had a best friend by the name of Agrippa? Agrippa is really the commander of the fleet. Octavius is deferring to him. Octavius is there. He is seasick. He's not much of a sailor, but that's okay. Agrippa is leading the forces, and he's leading them quite expertly, I should say. And Cleopatra, as the battle begins, suddenly she and her ships just turn around and leave the battle. And remember, this is supposed to be Rome against Cleopatra, Rome against Egypt, although Antony had been leading the battle. He'd been up front, and suddenly Cleopatra turns around and sails away, and he sees her sailing away. And he says, "I can't go on without my wife." And he hops into a boat and he leaves. He actually has himself taken to her ship as it's leaving, and boards her ship and leaves the battle. And all his soldiers that have an entire fleet outfitted there, they just saw their general leave, pack up and leave, and so they all surrender. Okay, we give up. We're Romans. What are we doing fighting other Romans if Antony's not with us? We don't have anything against Rome. And so they immediately surrender, and it is a complete fiasco and gives the victory to Octavius. Now, from here now, Octavius is going to continue to the east. And so Antony and Cleopatra, they've gone back home to Egypt. They're going to try to recoup their losses. They've got lots of money in Egypt. They haven't lost that many ships, so they've still got something of a navy there. But they've lost the entire Roman contingent. There's no more Roman soldiers in their forces because they all went over to Octavius. Now Herod hops in a boat and he sails to Rhodes, where Octavius has paused for just a bit. he goes before Rhodes and he says, "Look, I have always been loyal to anyone I've been loyal to. I was loyal to Pompey when Pompey came down. I was loyal to Julius Caesar when Julius Caesar was my mentor. When Antony was representing Rome, I've always been loyal to Rome, and Antony was Rome, even though now Rome has declared war on Cleopatra. In fact, he says, I actually advised Antony that he ought to divorce, I don't know, divorce or get rid of Cleopatra. He didn't listen to me, but I was loyal to Antony. I'm always loyal to my friends. I've been loyal to Rome, and I will be loyal to you because now you are Rome." And so Octavius likes this, and Octavius confirms him where he will continue to be king of the Jews. And so Herod, he has skated by in he has survived. I have to say about Herod, he was a survivor, and he's going to continue now as king of the Jews under Octavius, under Rome. Octavius will follow Antony and Cleopatra to Egypt. Antony is going to commit suicide. Cleopatra is captured, and Octavius has plans for her where he's going to take her back to Rome and will put her in chains and display his great victory. And instead of allowing that to happen, she has a snake bite her, a poisonous snake, and she commits suicide as well, leaving Octavius as the undisputed ruler of the entire Roman Empire, of all the lands in and around the Mediterranean. Now, he's going to be given the title, he gets back to Rome, and they're going to give him the title, the August one, the Augustus. And that's the name that sticks. In fact, we have a month of the year that is named after him. August is named after Augustus, just as July is named after Julius Caesar. Those earlier months, going back all the way to from January all the way to June, are named after Roman gods. Roman gods and goddesses. But then we have two of the months that are named after the first two emperors, Julius Caesar and Octavius Augustus, and then the rest of the months are just named. They're named. They're given number names, numeral names. So we have September. That's the letter 7, the number 7. 8 for October. Think about how many sides there are in an octagon. November and December are all numerical names for the months. So he now becomes the Augustus, and this launches a period from 31 BC all the way to 15 AD, will be known as the Pax Romana, the Peace of Rome, where Rome will see an unprecedented period of relative peace. Now, I have to be careful there. That's not to say there are no wars, but there are very few wars. Wars are going to be far and few between during this period, the Pax Romana. He is also given the title the Divi Filius, that is the Son of God. Now think about these titles that he's given: the august one, the glorious one, the Son of God. He's given to these titles, and these titles, or at least variations of them, will be used of Jesus just a couple of generations later. So the Son of God, and this is going to be a period where the Roman Empire will tighten its belt. And when I start to say tighten its belt, I don't mean that things are going to be stringent, or they're going on a hunger strike. I mean that things are going to be solidified, where the Roman Empire will become indeed a true empire. The Roman roads will connect this empire together. Some of those roads you can still go to today. I remember the Ignatian Way in northern Greece follows the same path. They've got a big superhighway right next to the Ignatian Way that is there even today. And so it will be said that all roads lead to Rome, because this will be a time where the Roman Empire solidifies itself. Later on, it will grow even further, but for right now, its borders are set. At the end of his life, Octavius Augustus will quip, "I found Rome brick, I left her marble." Nor is he the only one who will see great building programs. Herod the Great is going to completely revolutionize the temple. Here's a drawing of what Zerubbabel's temple would have looked like. This is when they first came back from Babylon. Here we see the Seleucid edition. We've actually seen some of these in our class. The Hasmonean expansion. But Herod is going to take that entire area and he is going to expand it on all sides. Notice to the north there's going to be a fortress, there will be pools, there will be major gates, bridges. This is going to be an entirely new, literally, a new temple. On the northwest side of the temple, pictured in the upper part of our screen, notice the four towers will be the Antonia fortress, named for the one who had been one of his patrons early on, Mark Antony. It looked over the temple. The Jewish people always hated the fact that a Roman fortress named after a Roman, at one point, consul, looked down into their area of worship, and that's going to be a cause for concern among the Jews. But there was no moving the fortress; it's going to be there until the destruction of Jerusalem in the year 70 A.D. The temple itself, as I said, is expanded on all parts. You can see the temple in the middle and then the various courts that lead out from it. Notice there's a low wall. You can see it on either side of that. And that separated the inner courts from what now comes to be known as the court of the Gentiles. It's a huge area. And all he has to actually build up the mountain because remember, this was originally a mountain. And so it's not flat. It looks rather flat as we're looking at this model, but it's not flat. First of all, the closer you go to the temple, the higher you go. There's steps leading up to the area as you get closer and closer to the temple. But in order to give that flat appearance, in places he actually had to have either dirt brought in or sometimes big arches underneath holding up the ground underneath those areas. Some of those arches can still be seen even today, 2,000 years later. Here we're on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount, and that area immediately before us, just the lower portion of that today, is known as the Western Wall. Sometimes people call it the Wailing Wall, but that's not a designation our Jewish friends actually like. And notice the gates that go in. Sometimes there are stairways that lead you up to the area of the temple. Over on the left, there's a giant bridge over which would run an aqueduct to bring water to the temple. Remember that in order to have the washings, the ceremonial washings that you had in the temple, they would want to have what they call living water, that is flowing water. And so this is carried in by these various aqueducts leading into the temple. Here on this side, you can get a better picture of that wall that surrounded the inner court. Gentiles would only be allowed to up to, but not through that wall. There were gates every so often, and we've actually found signs that were written in Greek, probably some in Latin too, but the ones I've seen have been in Greek, on big stone monuments, saying, "No Gentile past this point upon pain of death." And this, past these areas would lead you first to the court of the women, which you see directly before you, and then there would be the 15 steps up to the Nicanor gate. You're always going uphill the closer you get to the temple, and you go through that, and you have the court of the men, and then the court of the priests, and then the temple itself. Notice over on the left-hand side of our picture, the upper left-hand side, you have a big giant set of colonnades. This was known as the royal stoa or the royal porch. You could have great meetings in this area. And then out in front of those, there are two gateways. Now, the picture shows two gateways. The one on the left should have not two, but three gates going through that area. These are the famous Huldah gates, named for Huldah the prophetess, and that would take you, that's the main exit and main entrance into the temple quarter. On the other side of Jerusalem, Herod built a magnificent palace, and you're looking at a model of what that palace would have looked like. It's on the west side of the city, and it had two wings, one named for Augustus and the other named for Agrippa. Now, that's not Agrippa, the grandson of Herod, but that's Agrippa, the best friend of Augustus, the military commander who had been so helpful to Octavius Augustus. And that's any sons of Herod that are named Agrippa, and he's going to have a grandson and a great grandson that will go by that name. They are named, remember, after that best friend of Octavius Augustus. And so the wings of the palace are given that name. There's an open plaza in the middle of that palace known as the Pavement. It had a Hebrew name too, the Gabbatha. Um, and it's probably here that Jesus is brought when he is placed on trial first before Pontius Pilate. I imagine that would have been in one wing. But since this was Herod's palace, the Herodian palace, I imagine occupying the other wing might have been one of the sons of Herod, Herod Antipas. And you'll remember that Pilate actually sends Jesus. I don't think he sent Jesus all the way across the city and back. They probably would have not had time to do that. But he does have time to send him from one end of the palace to the other. And so I suspect, this is my opinion at least, that the last three trials of Jesus, the trial before Pilate and then Herod Antipas and then back to Pilate again, all took place in this palace. On the north side of that palace were three great towers. The tallest was named for Herod's brother Phasael. Remember, he is the one who had been captured and had committed suicide. The next was named for a close friend of Herod that we haven't mentioned yet, Hippicus. And then the third tower was named for the woman that's eventually going to be Herod's wife, Mariamne, or at least one of those wives. And this was the Mariamne Tower, supposed to have been very ornate, very beautiful, as was she. Another of Herod's fortresses that he built is known as the Herodium. Now, it stands there today. It looks a little bit like a volcano. That's artificial. That's actually built up. If you look at the way it would have looked in Herod's day, and it's been torn down, it had that sloping area went up to a fortification and then a great tower, and there were antechambers out in front of it. There was and still is a giant, I'd say Olympic-sized or bigger pool. There's no water in it today, but there would have been back then with colonnades all around it. Beautiful area. I took this picture actually from Bethlehem, looking south. And remember that Herod had fought that retreating battle against the Parthians and the Pharisees when they tried to capture him and drove him from the land. And he built that palace here to commemorate his victory and escape that eventually led to his being recognized by the Romans as King of the Jews. The most glorious palace, and we're only looking at a few of them. There were a great many more, but this is Masada. Remember, Masada was where he had brought Mariamne and his retinue, and then had left them here in safety as he continued on to eventually go to Rome. While they were here, the Jews had tried to attack them and could not make their way. They could not gain entrance. They had plenty of food stored here. Herod had always made sure that it was a place of safety. But they did run short at one point of water. They were on the verge of giving up because they were getting so thirsty. And then there was one of those very rare rains where it rained here and filled up the reservoirs, and they were able to hold out until Herod was able to come back with the Romans and relieve them. Herod also built a seaport for the Jews. One of the problems that the coastline always had, even though there were a few port cities, there were no natural harbors along the coast of Israel. And so he resolved to build a giant breakwater that would form a artificial harbor where ships could come in and go out. And if a storm broke out, they would be safe within this harbor. The city that contained the harbor was to be named Caesarea after his patron. I've been calling him Octavius Augustus, but he actually changed his legal name, and we call it that because it would not be confusing that way. But he actually had legally changed his name to Gaius Julius Caesar. Since there's already Gaius Julius Caesar we're talking about in this class, I don't want to be confusing and refer to him by that name. So in history, we generally refer to him as either Caesar Augustus or Octavius Augustus, and that has been my practice during this class. Because there was no natural springs at Caesarea, and it is going to be called Caesarea Maritimia, Caesarea on the ocean. There's going to be another Caesarea that's inland, but he has water piped along a giant aqueduct along this area. Actually, three such aqueducts bringing water from as far away as 9 to 15 miles away, and the aqueducts are still standing even today. Now, Herod has a number of wives. He does not follow the Roman or the Greek custom of only having one wife at a time, although that is the way he started out. Doris, I believe, if memory is correct, was his first wife, but then he had divorced her, remember, to marry Mariamne. And before it's done, I put four wives here. The correct number would be closer to 10. And by the time we're done, he is going to be like the Eastern kings of collecting a number of wives and concubines, and so he will have a number of these at the same time. From Mariamne, and remember, she is the last surviving Hasmonean. And she's going to have two sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. And I'm done putting numbers behind names because we've already seen a bunch of those. So Alexander and Aristobulus, the two sons of Herod by Mariamne. And one of them is slated. The plan is, it's not going to come to fruition, but the plan is that possibly one of these might eventually replace him as king and maybe even become high priests so that we could have the idea of a king who is a priest because even though Herod's not from the line of priests, Mariamne is. And so that would be the thinking behind that. From Doris, he has Antipater, and actually this was his firstborn, although she is divorced in favor of Mariamne. Eventually, he will reconcile with her and with her son Antipater. Uh, Malthace, or actually they'd probably pronounce it more Malthaki, but whichever pronunciation we give, she's going to give birth to Archelaus and Antipas. Now we know him sometimes as Herod Antipas. A number of these are going to take the surname Herod just because he is Herod the Great, and they want to be connected to him. And we're going to see both Archelaus and Antipas in the New Testament. And then finally, Mariamne gives birth to Philip. There will be another Philip as well. I just couldn't fit them on the chart. I think both of them are mentioned in the New Testament. So when I see Herod Philip, he's there in the New Testament as well. Now, Aristobulus, and just to fill this out, is going to have three children, and two of these are in the New Testament. So we're getting up to the New Testament era. And not Aristobulus, but Agrippa, and we know him as Agrippa the First. He's going to be in the book of Acts, and we'll see him there in Acts chapter 12, where James is put to death and Peter is arrested. That's all in the days of Agrippa. And also, he has a sister named Herodias. Herodias is going to be married to Philip, but then later on, she's going to run away with Antipas, her cousin. Not even a cousin. Yes, I guess that would be her uncle by another mother. It's sort of tenuous there. But she's going to run away with Antipas, and John the Baptist is going to say, that's adultery. You shouldn't be doing that. And both of them are going to be in the New Testament as well. Now, a problem arises with Mariamne where Herod initially there were a couple of times where Herod came close to be putting to death, and he had said, if I die, make sure Mariamne goes with me. I don't want to, I don't like the idea of her marrying someone else. Make sure she dies as well. And apparently she heard about that. And then after the birth of her two sons, he begins to uncover plots aimed at putting him to death and having one of those two sons put in his place. And he begins to suspect her, and eventually he brings her up on charges, and she is executed. So here's a wife that is killed, and it's not too long after that, where the plots continue, and both those sons, Alexander and Aristobulus, they are also put to death. Not only them, but toward the end of his life, and we're not there yet, but just preview of things to come. He will have Antipater arrested, and he also will be executed just a few days before Herod the Great himself dies. It is so bad where three of his sons had been put to death by his hand. So bad that Octavius, the emperor, quips that it is better to be Herod's hus than to be Herod's huios. Now you have to, you can hear how it rhymes, but you have to understand what he's saying. It's better to be Herod's pig than to be Herod's son. Because Herod, growing up in that Jewish tradition, kept the dietary laws of the Jews. He didn't eat pig, but he had gobbled up his own sons, not literally, but he had put them to death. It's safer to be Herod's pig than it is to be Herod's son. And Octavius had known several of those boys. In fact, some of them had been raised in Rome and had become special to him. He was rather upset at Herod. He said, I understand things like this happen, but he wasn't happy about it. And so the quote comes to us even today. Now, I'm picking up with Josephus here as we come to the end of Herod's life. But now Herod's distemper greatly increased upon him after a severe manner, and this by God's judgment upon him for his sins, for a fire glowed in him slowly, which did not so much appear to the touch outwardly as it augmented his pains inwardly. For it brought upon him a vehement appetite for eating, which he could not satisfy with one sort of food or the other, always hungry, yet never able to satisfy his hunger, even though he would eat and eat and eat. Josephus continues, his intestines were also ulcerated, and the chief source of his pain lay on his colon. An aqueous and transparent fluid also had settled itself around his feet, and a like matter afflicted him at the bottom of his belly. Nay, further, his privy member was putrefied and produced worms. That sounds like an awful way to go. Herod was in agony toward the end of his life. And when he sat upright, he continues, he had difficulty breathing, which was very loathsome on account of the stench of his breath and the quickness of its returns. He had also convulsions in all parts of his body, which increased his stench to an insufferable degree. This was a bad death. Finally, as he approached death, and it became apparent that he was dying, he ordered the arrest of all the nobility, all the VIPs. He had them brought to Caesarea by the ocean, where there was a great, what they called a hippodrome, a horse or chariot racing stadium. You can still see it even today. They were locked in here with orders that when he died, that they were all to be killed, not because they were his enemies, not because they had done anything to him. They were to be killed so that all throughout Israel there would be national mourning instead of national rejoicing. This is the kind of death that he died. We actually found back, I think it was in 2007, I was actually there just before the find was discovered. One of my students showed up just after I had left the area of Bethlehem and the Herodian, and they found this in pieces. My students were actually, one of them was sending pictures to me as they found the various pieces lying around the Herodian. And they took the pieces and put it all together, and it turned out to be a very ornate sarcophagus. They believe now, not sure, but they believe that this might have been the sarcophagus eventually of Herod the Great. You can see what his people thought of him. They smashed it up and took the pieces and scattered them around the area. And that's the death that he died. It was shortly before this death. Was it a few months, maybe a year or two, not too much earlier, just shortly before his death, that we have the story of the Magi taking place in Matthew chapter 2, where these Magi from the east come to Jerusalem and they say, "Where is the one who was born King of the Jews?" And of course, they're looking for Jesus who had been born. Herod was fit to be tied, but he couldn't say so. And so he plays dumb and he plays sincere, but he's not at all. He's out to get anyone, even one of his own sons, who stands in the way of him being king. And so you know the rest of the story, how God intervenes. The Magi come and find the baby Jesus, and yet he escapes. He escapes to Egypt, the same place that Herod had escaped to when his kingdom had initially been overthrown back in 40 BC. Uh, Jesus escapes to Egypt with his parents, but then once Herod has died, he's brought back to be raised and eventually to grow up, to live, to minister, and to die on a cross for sins. But that is another story.